All right. Welcome to our webinar on bipartisan permitting reform. I'm Neil Brown, Managing Director of the Progressive Policy Institute, and I'm really pleased to welcome Congressman Josh Harder. He's Congressman from the 9th District of California and been doing some fantastic work to try to shepherd through some permitting reform that's really needed. So Congressman, I know we've got a quick talk here, but wanted to kind of give you the floor to talk about the importance of this issue, permitting reform, what this means to the country, and also what this means to your district and your constituents.
Yeah, well, fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Neil, for all the work that you and PPI does more broadly. I think it's never been more important than it is right now, pulling folks together for discussions like this. So thank you, and excited to hear all the tremendous panelists soon. Ultimately, we really need to make sure that we lower energy prices. And the best way to lower energy prices is to build more energy projects. It seems pretty basic, but we haven't been able to speed up the pace of getting stuff moving for many years. There have been some near misses. We've gotten to the 5 yard line. We haven't gotten across into the end zone. And so that's really what I think is so important for us to do in the next, really month or two, because I think time is ticking here. But to step back, the reason why this is important is the bottleneck, both for affordability and for economic growth more generally, is building more energy. The average permitting time for NEPA in the United States right now is 4.5 years. Most big projects take longer than that. Some take over a decade just navigating the permitting process. That's insane. I think it should be a pretty core principle that it should be faster to get the project permitted than it should take to actually build it. Right now, we've got that reversed, and it's taking way longer to actually get the project approved than actually put the shovels in the dirt. And that, of course, is being exacerbated because of the energy demand that we've seen. We've been in a period of flat energy demand for the past 2 decades. Now we're seeing that change because of AI and data centers, electrification, onshoring. So I think that makes it more important than ever to make sure that we're getting projects done. And the best way to do that is through bipartisan permitting reform.
And really appreciate your work on that. So what do you see in your district? I mean, you have any good stories on how this kind of difficulty in getting permits is affecting your constituents specifically?
Absolutely. I mean, we've seen the price of energy in my district double over the last decade. People talk a lot about the cost of living in California, and generally they mean the housing, but it's also the energy. I've got some families in Stockton that are paying more in their monthly electricity bill than they're paying in their monthly rent. Some folks last summer were paying $1,000 a month just to keep the lights and the AC on. I've spoken to a lot of seniors who have to turn on their AC only in non-peak hours. They have to go to a cooling center, all because they can't afford the bill at the end of the month. All of that is a direct result because we've made it so difficult to actually generate and move energy. And so the folks that are actually picking up the bill are pretty upset. PG&E, our major utility, is probably the least popular organization in town. And ultimately, the best way to fix it isn't just by yelling at the executives there, but by making it easier to actually build these projects in the first place.
Right. Well, I know you've introduced the Freedom Act. I want to first commend you on the acronym. It's impressive. Fighting for reliable energy and ending doubt for open markets. There you go. Talk a little bit about that. What does this do specifically in the whole kind of ecosystem of permitting reform as it is?
We've seen projects canceled that are hours or days away from operation just because of a political vendetta. That's wrong. I've seen my Republican colleagues being really frustrated at what they saw of the interference of the Obama and Biden administrations in the permitting process, canceling projects that they didn't like. And now, of course, a lot of my Democratic colleagues are pretty frustrated about what we've seen out of the Trump administration. And I think it should be, again, a core principle that projects should be permitted based on merit, based on the quality of the application and whether or not the project's a good idea, not based on whether or not they have a friend in high office. That's just a terrible way to make any decision, especially decisions that require the size of the investments for energy. More broadly, just talking politics, I don't think that there's any way for permitting reform to get done without a guarantee that the projects that are going to be permitted, the expedition that is going to happen as a result of this process, is based on that merit and not on these political vendettas. So the Freedom Act is pretty simple. It is a bipartisan bill that substantially raises the bar for a project being canceled. We still allow agencies to halt projects in extreme circumstances if there's a clear immediate safety need or if the permit issued was illegal, but it raises that bar pretty significantly. And again, the idea here is you shouldn't be able to change the rules of the game after developers have already played by those rules. But right now we see that happening all over the place.
Right. And the important part of that, I think, is the tech neutral piece of this. You're not choosing any preference over which technologies in the permitting process there. Yeah, so, the Freedom Act really looks at projects that have already been permitted, kind of protecting those that have gone through that. Kind of looking at, and you touched on this, kind of looking forward to projects that may be in the pipeline that may be not permitted yet. How do we address those with some certainty, going forward and looking at the ability to get new projects permitted without this the technology being preferenced in one way or another?
I think it's important to say that the Freedom Act is the linchpin of permitting reform, but there's a lot more that needs to happen. We do need full-scale NEPA reform. We need transmission reform to make it so we can get, wind from Wyoming and Nevada into California. We need to be able to fix more than just this permit certainty piece. But the Freedom Act does a lot. I mean, it's trying to make sure that once a project has gone through this full permitting process, begun construction, millions already invested, that there's confidence that the rug isn't going to be pulled out from under them. And so there's a couple different components here, making sure that there is expedited court review, limits on third-party litigation, protecting permits against permits being revoked, which is what we've seen, unfortunately, time and time again over the last year, and also making sure that we're speeding up this process, and if agencies can't be dragging their feet. And so another piece here that I think is really important is making it available for court-approved contractors to move forward on these permits, and a compensation fund if deadlines aren't being reached. So this isn't just about trying to make sure that we're stopping projects or continuing projects that have already been permitting, but also trying to make sure that the hindrances and the that we've seen over the last year don't continue.
One last question for you. You talked how many times we've been to the 5-yard line on this. What do you see? What's your crystal ball say? How do we get this across the finish line this time? What's getting in our way, and how can we get that last push in to get this done?
What gives me I don't tell folks I'm optimistic. I tell people I'm determined, because I think optimism is tough. My crystal ball has broken time and time again over the last year.
I was
I'm
going to ask a
constantly
borrower.
surprised. But I am determined because we've got to get this right. And if we don't do this over the next couple of months, I think it's going to be a real challenge, especially in an election year. But what gives me some confidence behind that determination is that the political forces behind this, the coalition that's been built, is stronger and more organized than it's been at any other part of this permitting fight over the last couple of years. Obviously, I'm a member and leader in Build America Caucus, which we created in the House as a bipartisan permitting reform hub. But there's lots of other pieces of this coalition across the vantage point. So I think whatever optimism we have, we've got a better chance now than we've had for a long time, and we've got to push as hard as we can until it gets across the finish line.
That's great. I want to thank you again for your time. I know you've got a long day ahead of you. I want to let you get a few minutes back. And again, Congressman Josh Hart, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for all the work you do.
Absolutely. And want to welcome the rest of our panel today. You guys can, I'm really excited about this conversation. Got some of the smartest people in this game right here with me on here, and I always learn a lot from talking to these folks, so really excited about this. Um, we'll go ahead and start. Zan Fishman is the VP for Energy at the Bipartisan Policy Center. And on this follows it very closely. I'd like to kick it to you to kind of give us an overview. Are you determined? What do you see the playing field look like right now on permitting reform?
I'm definitely determined, and I'm optimistic.
Okay.
I think we can get a permitting reform, comprehensive bipartisan permitting reform bill passed and signed into law this year, for a bunch of reasons. First of all, we kind of have to, right? Because if we don't, the consequences are large and growing, right? People are starting to experience firsthand the effects of our slow, broken, embarrassing permitting system. The electricity costs are rising, energy costs are rising, and that's going to get worse over time, rather than better over time. But more than that, I think there's just growing recognition that permitting reform is a bipartisan priority, right? It used to kind of feel like it was more partisan. It used to kind of feel like it was more something that like the business community wanted and the environmental community opposed. More and more, I think people are realizing that our current permitting system is bad for everyday Americans, it's bad for business, and it's bad for the environment. Because if we care about environmental outcomes, we want to reduce pollution. The way to reduce pollution is to upgrade our energy system with clean energy. And if we want to have access to affordable energy, if we want our economy to grow, we need the energy to do that. And those things are no longer in conflict in the same way that they used to be decades ago, right? Decades ago, our permitting reform system was put in place because there was just massive pollution. Rivers catching on fire, right? Now the new technology that people want to build is going to reduce pollution rather than increase pollution. And so because of that, I'm really optimistic that there's a path forward.
Oh, great. Thanks, Ann. Let's turn now to Bailey Brown, Head of Government and External Affairs for Inclusive Abundance. Talk to us about abundance. How does this play in? And I'm particularly interested in kind of, this demand we're seeing, and AI in particular, data centers, and how does the kind of American abundance of energy right now play into this permitting conversation?
Yeah, happy to. Hi, everyone. I'm Bailey Brown. I'm Inclusive Abundance Head of Government and External Affairs. And I think that it's really amazing how the rise of the abundance movement is happening right at the same time of the rise of load growth. I think that it's a great way that we can answer the call of rising demand today. Zan talked a little bit about this, but AI and manufacturing are coming online. And I think we've used to think about this problem as something that was going to happen in the future, but it's really happening right now. And so companies are trying to very quickly build and they're trying to find where they're getting their energy sources from. And if we cannot get them the energy sources that they need in a clean way, then they will turn to fossil fuel production. I think, a lot of folks here are trying to answer, progressive goals and how do we mitigate climate change. And, it's important to do that in an all of the above way framework and not hold back any particular energy source, but at the same time, the permitting reform challenges today are penalizing clean in a way that is really challenging to meet the climate goals that we need. And so I think what I would challenge this group to think about is how Zan talked about how permitting reform used to be really just helpful for fossil fuel sources, but today we need permitting reforms to help solar, wind, battery storage, geothermal, nuclear, and then we also need the transmission to help connect all of these sources together. The transmission need in this country is huge. We need to get these clean energy sources connected to the grid and make sure that these lines are built out to get the energy to go to the places that we need. I think abundance gives us a framework that we can answer this call in a way that benefits both consumers, the environment, and the future of the country. So we can talk a little bit more about what this means from a climate perspective, but I think the key that we want to answer right now is just what Congress can do in this moment and how we can answer this in the next year before the Congress is over.
Great, thank you. John DeBar, Executive Director for the National Petroleum Council. Welcome. First, if you got a 30-second or maybe less, what is the National Petroleum Council? I know you guys have just released a comprehensive kind of paper on permitting reform. Would love to hear a little bit more about that. And then how do your recommendations to the Secretary in the report play into what Congress needs to do to get this done?
Thanks, Neil. So the National Petroleum Council is a federal advisory committee to the Department of Energy. Our remit is to advise on the oil and gas industry. As a federal advisory committee, we're able to bring together both our industry sector members, which are about half of the membership, and knowledgeable energy experts from across the United States, including tribal members, academics, think tanks, environmental NGOs, state regulators. So we bring together a really holistic view of what our recommendations are. And as an advisory committee, we're able to make recommendations both to administrative and federal agencies for legislative fixes, state regulation, industry action, research development, et cetera. So pretty broad remit. We did recently publish a study on permitting. It was basically a refresh of our 2019 study. The request from the Secretary was, what can we do in permitting to increase the availability of affordable, reliable, and secure energy for American consumers and our allies? So that's a pretty broad subject. We came up with a number of the tactical items that actually the Congressman mentioned earlier today for legislative action. We can talk more about what those are, about federal agency actions for the executive branch, for state regulators, and for industry bodies like North American Energy Reliability Council. One of the interesting takeaways, though, is that linear development isn't just more pipelines, it's also more transmission lines. Right. And as we did a deep dive into this, we said there's a number of areas where our recommendations are applicable to transmission as well as pipelines, and they're actually quite complementary in that the solutions for more transmission construction are also appropriate for pipelines and vice versa. So those were some of the recommendations that we made.
Oh, that's great. Great. Alon, we can follow up and have the last question in the first round here. Alon is the Director of Energy and Climate Policy here at the Progressive Policy Institute. Alon, you've just written your second of two fantastic papers looking at energy burdens. The first in the Congressional Black Caucus districts, and now latest in the Congressional Hispanic Caucus districts. And I'm curious to hear how you feel permitting reform affects these communities that you've written extensively about and the energy burdens that those communities have.
Yeah, thanks, Neil. As Neil mentioned, I'm PPI's Director of Energy and Climate Policy and recommend everyone check out my reports. These reports were really born out of some findings from the EIA's residential electricity or energy consumption survey that found that Black and Latino households are roughly twice as likely to experience some form of energy insecurity compared to white households. But this, the set of recommendations that we make is really applicable across the board for low income, infrastructurally disadvantaged communities, because these these households have lower income, so energy costs naturally, mechanically take up more of their household earnings. But also, if you live in a neighborhood with a really outdated grid, in a house that's really energy inefficient, you actually need to consume more energy to receive the same final energy services. And one of the big roadblocks, at least in the Democratic caucus, to permitting reform getting a wider hearing has been that this is just going to create problems for disadvantaged communities. They're going to get steamrolled. And what our papers find is actually that, especially in the context of load growth, where they're competing for electric supply with this massive new demand from electrification, from manufacturing, from data centers, is that you're fighting for an increasingly small share of a fixed pie. And so expanding the energy infrastructure in a much faster way really brings benefits to these disadvantaged communities. And something further is that the tools that are used to obstruct project development tend to be used more by wealthier communities with better resources. And so instead of making energy development a contest for who can shove it into someone else's neighborhood, well, what PPI would love to see is, more sets of objective environmental standards, just clarity on how industrial and manufacturing facilities can prevent pollution in their communities, but at the same time rationalize, innovate, and speed up in the permitting process so that we can build the energy infrastructure and generation that we need to compete in the future.
That's great. Thank you. Want to extend an invitation to anybody watching the webinar here to, if you have any questions, there's a Q&A button, I believe, at the bottom. We'll try to get along to some questions. But if you want to start doing that, I'll try to keep an eye on these things as I'm asking another round of questions here. Sand, you had mentioned, environmental groups used to be opposed to this. What's their reaction here? What are they asking for? What are they getting out of this permitting reform now that they felt like they weren't getting before?
It's two different things, really. One is that when you look at the types of infrastructure that are applying for permits and that are caught up in the NEPA queue, what you see now, which is very different than it was in the past, is that it's mostly projects that you would qualify as clean energy. There's geothermal and wind and nuclear and solar and transmission and batteries, which are the types of some enviros are pro-nuclear and some are anti-nuclear, but writ large, right? These are the kind of cleaner types of energy that the environmental community prefers, and they're getting held up in NEPA review. They're getting sued, often at higher rates even than fossil fuel infrastructure. Solar gets sued at the highest rate. But it's not just energy; it's also conservation projects, right? If you're looking at doing conservation or ecosystem restoration, those types of things also need to get permits, and those get held up in very lengthy reviews. And you can find like forest management projects as well to prevent wildfires, which is why you've seen the bipartisan Fix Our Forests Act in the House and the Senate. And so when you just look at, okay, these are the projects that enviros like, and you say, all right, they're getting held up and taking years and years, and they're getting sued, and those lawsuits take years and years. I think it's just easy for anyone to look at the system and say, it doesn't work well. It just makes no sense, right? It really shouldn't be acceptable in the modern United States of America for this process to take so many years to get to a yes or no and maintain that level of uncertainty through, up to 6 years of lawsuit filing period. It just is a system that isn't designed for success.
That's great. We've gotten a question which happens to be the exact question that I was going to ask Bailey now. So this is great. Everybody's synced up here. Let's talk about transmission. What's a transmission deal look like, Bailey, in this permitting reform? Everybody, I think, has mentioned it in one way or another this morning. So that has been a source of friction, trying to get past that and find something that's acceptable to everyone here. what are you seeing? How do we get there?
So I think transmission is super important to make sure that we can connect these energy projects to the grid and is going to help keep our costs low. I think our grid is in sore need of both repair for the current lines as well as building out new linear infrastructure, like John alluded to. So I think when we're thinking about what these transmission provisions could look like, many folks look at the Energy Permitting Reform Act of 2024 that Senators Manchin and Barrasso negotiated in the Senate. The provisions in that bill really encouraged both interregional transmission to get built and what cost allocation looks like for those lines. So when transmission lines get built in different regions, you have to make sure, someone's got to pay for that. And so there are different ways that you can structure that, but the primary actor in this space is FERC. So FERC is, a lot of those provisions were directing FERC to go through a planning process and make sure that FERC is an active leader in making sure that these transmission lines that are in the national interest get built. My former boss, Congressman Peters, has a few different proposals in this space, and his bill with Congressman Andy Barr, the Speed and Reliability Act, takes some of those provisions from the Manchin-Barrasso bill. And so I think that's some of it. I think there are also, I guess you could say, smaller transmission provisions that are a little bit easier of a lift, which are things like reconductoring and GETS, the grid enhancing technologies. And that's really important to make sure that we're getting the most out of our grid.
Right.
Yeah, Neil, can I just jump in on that?
Please.
Because everything Bailey said is right. Like there's all these very specific transmission provisions that people are considering as part of permitting reform. And I think that's a really important piece. But it's also just worth saying that all of the permitting provisions that people are talking about would be really important for transmission itself, right? Not just the ones that are focused on transmission, right? NEPA reforms, judicial review reforms, those are actually really important for transmission. Clean Water Act reforms, like the kinds of things that people typically think of as being important for pipelines, are actually really important for transmission lines too, and would be even more important in a world where some of the transmission provisions related to the Federal Power Act get enacted, because right now transmission lines are blocked using one legal device. But if we fix that legal device, but we don't fix the Clean Water Act kind of state veto, that'll just be the new way that people block transmission lines. So all the transmission specific stuff really important, but it's just worth saying that like all of the NEPA, judicial review, Clean Water Act, all of these things are actually really important for transmission lines too, not just kind of traditional or generation infrastructure.
Yeah, that's great. And John, I guess that leads right into my next question about existing right-of-way and how that plays into this and developing, and that I know it's equally important to transmission and pipeline development.
Yeah, one of the interesting things from our work on permitting is that there's really sort of a slightly different approach to things if it's linear development in a green field where there's never been anything built before, because then there's the sort of the known unknowns. There are impacts, we don't know what they are. Whereas if you're, say, adding a new pipeline in the same right of way as an existing pipeline, you already know who lives there, what the species are that live there, what the water crossings are. So they're really already well understood impacts that can then be addressed, as sort of repeat of the same rather than something new. The other thing we learned is that where the right of way, or let's call it sort of facility location, is something that is already a industrial facility, a transformer station or a switchgear station, a pumping station, a compression station. It's there. Everybody knows where it is. So the ability to study an expansion within that same footprint is fairly straightforward and we're not really, as the icebreakers like to say, cutting fresh ice. So it really allows you to say, well, what is streamlining? Well, you can streamline a lot of things when the risks and impacts are already well understood. That's one of the key areas. Thank you.
That's great. Alon, you want to jump in here? Maybe how are Democrats in general and kind of the different factions of the Democratic Party kind of moving on this? Are we going to get enough pragmatic Democrats on board to get this done? And how's this look, into the midterms? Kind of game this out for us.
Yeah, well, I think the Democratic caucus has been fairly split on the issue. Like I said, there have been concerns about the environmental justice impacts, as I mentioned in the previous question. There have been questions about whether this is going to unleash, unobstructed fossil fuel development that runs counter to environmental goals. But really, what we have found is that these concerns are really manageable and often benefit from further permitting reform. The real blockers have been that the Trump administration has really taken like a lawfare approach to clean energy development, specifically calling them unreliable and saying that we don't need any more of them. And so, given the Trump administration's actions, especially against offshore wind, but also onshore wind and solar, the Democrats, especially in the Senate, have felt burned by these negotiations. What I think is that these problems really give more of a reason to pass legislative permitting reforms, changing the regulatory rules for permitting or for deployment wherever those obstructions come up, are something that needs to happen on a bipartisan basis just because of the structure of the Senate. And so I think it's really worth looking at whether we're going to obstruct all forms of energy and keep a set of rules on the books that benefit existing technologies that are already on the grid, or whether we're going to make a real progressive change and meet the challenges of load growth and also of reducing emissions. There are places where a permitting reform deal would really benefit Democratic caucus goals. But I think really the importance is that this has to be bipartisan. So there's always going to be a bit of push and pull. But the only way to really achieve certainty is with a legislative deal, because that's what proves to be durable across presidential administrations and insulates the permitting and environmental review process from the vicissitudes of partisan flips.
Great. We've got another question from an audience member. Says, I'm curious the way they think. We haven't seen more involvement from AI leaders in the space of energy permitting. That it's essential to lowering energy costs, improving public perception of data centers, whether tech involvement would be helpful or harmful in getting a deal done. Anybody want to jump in on that one? All right, no one wants to touch the AI leaders, huh?
I
Go for it, man.
We had our at the Bipartisan Policy Center 2 weeks ago. We hosted a big permitting summit in the U.S. Capitol, in the congressional auditorium, like underneath the U.S. Capitol, and we had all sorts of people: Democrats, Republicans in the House and the Senate. We had PERC commissioners. We had environmental leaders. We had business leaders. And one of the people we had was the head of energy at Google, right? And his focus was on building out AI and the energy needs they have for that. So I would say that there has been a big focus on the energy component among the AI leaders. They want to build their data centers. And right now, the main barrier they have to doing that is not the data centers themselves, but access to energy, right? And the access to energy is purely a permitting issue. So they're focused on it. And I think they are pushing on it in a way that's helpful. But in terms of should they be doing more? I guess my answer is everyone should be doing more, right? Everyone should just be yelling from the rooftops about how important permitting reform is, and how important it is for everyone to come together to get this deal done.
I'll add to that, Neil, that as part of the appointment of members to the National Petroleum Council, DOE has traditionally had sort of major energy consumers as part of the council member. they added two major data center operators
Mhm.
to the NPC this past last month in recognition of that question.
That's great. Yeah. I mean, I guess, a question that's been put to me, what more can industry do? And I'm particularly thinking of kind of fossil fuel industry, pipeline industry. What can they do to help push this forward? And I'll put the same question on, the others on the panel. What can the green energy and renewable energy world do to push that? John, I'll kick you the fossil industry question. What can they be doing to help move the constituencies that listen to them?
Yeah, so one big part of our communication effort that I and my team are charged with is to get to the regulators and especially the committees of jurisdiction on Capitol Hill. So while we all have the usual Senate ENR, EPW discussions, we're also working with the committee that authorizes Army Corps and the committee on the committees on judiciary to work on APA reform and NEPA reform. So a lot of very wonky acronyms, but it's really getting our information into the staff, but majority and minority staff, with the support of the DOE Congressional Affairs team, to get in there and say, these are our recommendations. This is why it improves the quality of the permits that will come out, and both the durability, but also the thoroughness. So that's a big part of what we're doing right now. And the forum we have today is another opportunity to do that. Thanks.
And on the renewable side, what's the push there? What's the carrot for the renewable folks and what can they be doing to push for their side of the
I'm happy to answer that and
Sure.
touch on the other tech question. I think to answer the tech question first, the benefit of having tech companies weigh in on permitting reform right now is that they have such an urgency to go really fast. And so I think it adds a different dynamic. It's not energy companies, that's their business. That's what they need to do. They're going to be asking for it because they need to be able to build the energy projects that they want. But I think with tech, they need to go fast in order to build data centers to make sure that the United States can really be the AI leader of the world. And so I think it's helpful for them to weigh in. I think there are obviously challenges though on public sentiment on data centers, and I think there's a real NIMBY confrontation on data centers, and that is very real, and we can't ignore that that's happening. And so the kind of baby movement that started before the abundance movement was the YIMBY movement. And I think that there are some lessons to be learned there where, it's important to work with communities and make sure that there aren't necessarily these artificial veto points to prevent these projects, either the data centers or the energy projects, from being built, but make sure that there's, real substantive input there. And then on clean energy, I think, the clean energy industry has been really vocal about the need for permitting reform, and, litigation is a serious problem for them as well. I will say that, they're in a really tough place right now because they've gone through a lot of setbacks over the past year or so with both, permits being yanked by the current administration, as well as the rollback of some of the IRA clean energy tax credits. And so they're kind of fighting a lot of different fronts right now. And I think that, they're better though to Democrats in this conversation and Republicans, where, lots of different members have clean energy projects being built in their districts. So it's important that their voices are heard too.
That's great. Yeah, it's it's amazing to me. We're seeing two different kind of parts of the energy industry that are for the first time really willing to kind of help each other out when they have been kind of at friction with each other for the longest time, realizing that this is just a problem for everybody and we've got to solve this. I guess a political question, I'll throw it open, and Bailey, just to follow on with you. I'm thinking of, what Trump has done with the offshore wind and really hostile to a lot of renewable development, but also the Biden administration's, pulling of Keystone XL and also the LNG pause at the end of the administration. Yeah, how do we stop this ping-ponging? How do we, do we think this permitting reform will put an end to this, or is there more of a political conversation that we need to be having about this? And I'll throw this open. Anybody wants to jump in? Not all at once, though. Alon, you got some ideas on that?
Well, as I mentioned, I think, the Freedom Act really tries to take a stab at this, and the only answer is bipartisan legislation, trying to do these major reforms through a regulatory process that, is also riddled with problems, the artificial rigor of the notice and comment process, the lawsuits that inevitably follow, different regulatory changes, especially with the Supreme Court that's concerned about the major questions doctrine. And then just, again, the efforts of each successive administration trying to, put their own stamp on it. That's some measure that is natural in a democracy, but we really need to ask the legislative branch to step up. And from the Democratic side, again, there's going to be a give and take. And so recognizing that there are some partners across the aisle to work with, but also that, we need to become more conversant in the ins and outs of the process so that we can know what we are arguing for and what we're trying to get passed, especially, talking to industry stakeholders and making sure that the reforms are aligned with, caucus goals, but at the same time recognizing that it's not going to be a perfectly clean, designed in a lab by the Enviros bill that gets passed. It's going to be representative of the whole Congress, and it really has to be for it to be durable.
We've covered a lot of ground here. I want to give everybody a chance to talk about anything we haven't discussed, or like any insights you might have into what we can expect coming up. Zan, you want to have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the thing that's interesting to me is it really appears that everyone is circling around the contours of a deal that's fairly well understood, right? It'll include components of NEPA and judicial review. It'll include transmission components. It'll include project certainty components. It'll likely include some Clean Water Act, and I think, some narrow targeted Clean Water Act fixes that are, predictably important for linear infrastructure. There'll probably be some more minor things that might be tech specific, like geothermal parity and mill sites for ancillary activities for mining, things like that. Things like you found in the EPRA bill from Manchin and Barrasso last Congress. And it felt like all of that was moving really in the right direction. And the thing that kind of put a hurdle in front of us most recently was when in December the Trump administration issued a stop work order for the 5 offshore wind projects. And even though the courts kind of batted those all down, the Trump administration is appealing that, and so still kind of TBD on what happens there. But after that happened, Senators Whitehouse and Heinrich basically said, that's it. If you're going to just continually stick a knife in every renewable project that you can, we're not negotiating a bill. And they said, until we see some sort of showing of good faith from the Trump administration, we're done negotiating a permanent bill, right? So despite all my optimism, like we're currently in this kind of murky situation where we're on a pause. And the question is, how do we get on pause, right? What can we do to push and pull all the various actors that matter? The White House, Congress, industry, environmental groups, to all say, guys, we have to work this out. We have to figure out a path forward. That's where we're in. But again, we're in this backdrop of most people probably got the highest electricity bill in their lives this month. After the long cold snap in January, right? The highest electricity bills in their lives, right? And we're seeing it become an election issue, these high electricity prices. So the salience of this issue is only going to grow. And it just serves nobody if we don't solve this problem, right? There's no real political win if we don't solve this problem, right? You know, higher energy prices, higher emissions, lower quality of life, losing the AI race to China, whatever the negative, outcome is that we're going to get from not doing permitting reform, it's just bad. There's no upside here. And so, the thing that I'm really interested in is how do we keep pushing and pulling the administration and Congress and industry and the enviros and the think tanks and everybody who interacts with all of these stakeholders to get everybody back at the table, to get everybody taking concrete action that's just clearly going to be a win-win for everybody.
That's great. Thanks, Ann. Bailey, you want to jump in?
Couldn't agree more with what Sam said. I think the key piece here is do we want to be able to get a deal done by the end of this Congress? And if so, what are people willing to compromise and what are the kind of North Stars in order to get there? So I think this is, like Zan said, there are only bad outcomes if we continue to do nothing, and it will also just get worse. I also think that, a core tenet of abundance is, being outcomes oriented and having an eye toward implementation. And we have to acknowledge that even if we passed permitting reform tomorrow, like these things take a really long time to implement and get going. Courts have to, react and adjust and create new, standards. Agencies will need to set guidelines. Rulemaking processes will have to begin. So there's a lot more process that comes with it, even if we started doing this tomorrow. So it's not like tomorrow we'll pass it and then your energy bill will go down. It takes a while. So I think the real urgency for doing this now is really, really important. And I think we just have to be really realistic about what that looks like and how we can actually kind of come together to at least get something done, because continuing to do nothing about it, I think, is pretty depressing. So
that's great. Thanks. John, last thoughts?
Yeah, in addition to agreeing with everything that everyone else said, I really, going back on bipartisan reforms is a great idea. While passing a permitting reform won't immediately lower consumer bills, considering that 61% of EISs take more than 2 years, there are 4 years of delay results from having lawsuits against an EIS. Streamlining that part of the process will get lower energy bills faster, years faster to the consumer. Lowering the cost of building the infrastructure will mean there's less argument at public utilities commissions about how much to get passed on. If it's half as much the cost, it's half as much to the consumer, and half as much to the argument, I would hope. So it has a direct and proximate impact on consumers' reliability and affordability of energy. And I think one of the other really big pluses, and Dan just mentioned it a moment ago, we also did a piece of work on collaboration between the electric power industry and the natural gas industry last year. And one of the unique parts of that is we were able to get in a room and say, we both have these problems. We should make recommendations that fix them in parallel rather than just yours or just mine. And we think that's another really big positive for making of any kind of energy available to consumers.
Great. Alon, last thoughts for you. We had a couple of questions come in. I can touch on one of them quickly because it kind of goes to Bailey's, North Stars that everyone has. What specifically needs to happen to get this over the finish line? If you have any thoughts on that.
I think more work, more contact with congressional offices, more conversations within, everyone's respective constituencies. PPI is really known for our, pragmatic center-left approach, and we're not afraid to throw a few elbows to our left or our right. But I think in this case, talking to audiences where you have credibility is really important. Everyone needs to go back to their own camp and advocate really loudly and clearly for this. And something else that I wanted to touch on in terms of last thoughts is we talked about the impact of permitting delays and permitting reform on AI data centers and tech. I think it's also important to think about what tech can do for permitting reform. I'm not talking about having AI write an EIS. We're really not there yet. You can't just tell Claude, conduct this EIS, make no mistakes, and it'll just do it. But we're really in like the 1980s and 1990s in terms of, government tech. You still can't file your NEPA documents online, and building something like a central repository across the agencies of NEPA documents and the studies that are cited in them would be really helpful. Tokenizing them and turning them into an AI searchable database would be great, but I would be happy just if instead of spending, I think it was $500K in the Fiscal Responsibility Act on studying eNEPA, to just say, it's time to do this. We need to move us at least into the 21st century, if not to the cutting edge frontier models of 2026.
The infamous study to go live on forever. One last question for everybody. Someone asked, can you share talking points for them to advocate on this issue? I'll give everybody a quick plug on if you have anything to share with the audience. We will, make available this stream. I believe we'll be able to do that. But if you have anything to share with folks that want to become more active in this, Sam? Go to your website. Is that kind of
Sure, yeah, you can read all of our reports. It's the talking points I use are kind of the ones that I've been saying so far today, right? We clearly need it. It's got to be bipartisan. It's got to go through Congress if we want it to be durable, right? There's some people who say like the Trump administration can just make permitting good on their own, or on the other side, let's wait till the next Democratic administration and we'll make permitting perfect just for renewables, but not for fossil or whatever. None of that's going to work, right? You need a durable permitting system that lasts across administrations, whether it's Democrats in office or Republicans in office. You just need certainty. And if you do that, the outcomes will be good for emissions. They'll be good for reducing pollution, and they'll be good for the economy and Americans who want lower energy prices. It's just good for everyone across the board. And so, I really focus on the case that, the incentives for both the environment and business align in doing this the right way and doing this in a bipartisan way.
That's great. We'll leave it at that, Zed. I want to thank everyone again for joining me, and reach out to all these folks at their respective places, read all the reports. They're all fantastic. And let's go see if we can get something done that everybody seems to think needs to get done and make this easier. Thanks again from PPI for joining us, and look forward to next time.
Thanks.
Thanks all.
Thanks, y'all.
Thanks, Nick.